Good day, fellow militant Catholics, and welcome once more to an installment of Four Catholic Dudes. I'm Conlon Taylor, one of your hosts, and I'm joined once again by Larry Palma and Nick Young.
Hello.
Hello.
Today we will be discussing one of the most, in my opinion, interesting and long-lasting events in Christendom's history, and that is the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation.
I swear, if I don't get hate mail for this one, I don't know what it is.
So, the Reformation, what were its causes and effects? What sparked the Reformation? Larry, you like talking about corruption and things like that, so please explain.
Okay, so basically there was two main things that were happening: corruption in the church in multiple forms, some mainly in nepotism, where bishops were getting their family members to be like priests, higher bishops. So basically the church was just like being run by like a family at that point.
It was essentially a mafioso scheme at the time.
Yeah. And along with that, there was the indulgence controversy that was happening. Mm-hmm. Those bishops were trying to make money and priests were trying to make money. So they were selling indulgences in a way that wasn't meant to be. So an indulgence, what it's supposed to be is that you do penance in some way or form, and then the priest offers you reconciliation, and with that, your sins are completely forgiven and you're in a state of grace. Mm-hmm. But what they were doing was they were selling indulgences, which is not the way it's supposed to go. And yeah, that just led to even more corruption.
Mm-hmm. One of the biggest ones was when they were building St. Peter's Basilica. They were saying, if you help fund the building of the dome, we'll forgive your sins, which is essentially indulgence. And a lot of people did not like that because handing out indulgences they're social handouts,
passing out like candy.
Yeah, but I think a big thing is going to be the social political landscape of Western Europe at this time.
Right, and a lot of it goes back to, at least as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, to the Black Death, which decimated the priesthood, essentially. There was a lack of education in the priesthood because following the Black Death, many priests were killed among everybody else. And there was really no one to educate the next generation of clergy. And so what you got were people trying to pass off their own ideas as doctrine, and it became a disaster. And
also another thing, too, is at the time during the political landscape of Europe, a lot of nations were going through the Renaissance, for example, Italy, with Michelangelo and all that. And so a lot of people don't really go into this, but the Renaissance was usually split in two. The Southern Renaissance, which Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and all
the Italian.
Yeah, Italian. Well, essentially Italian, but it's referred as the Southern one. Mm-hmm. But the Northern one, however, was essentially happened during the Reformation. So a lot of historians usually say the Northern Renaissance was the Reformation due to the fact how the Reformation enabled a lot of people to make different kinds of art that was no longer God-centric, more man-centric. Mm-hmm. But I think it's time to stop being around a bush on this one and go for the main culprit behind this.
Yes.
Martin Luther.
Bum, bum, bum.
In the words of Pope Gregory, one drunk German.
The best kind. So, the question is, how did the Reformation affect Europe then and the world now?
Oh, hold on.
I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to talk about how Martin Luther affected this.
95 Theses.
Anybody?
Yes. Okay, so I shall explain. Please. So, Martin Luther, before becoming the head of Lutheran Church, was a monk at this time. So he was very into the faith, to put it lightly. He went to confession 1 hour a day for even the most meaningful stuff. Like I said, I accidentally tripped someone in an accident, or I accidentally sneezed while not covering my nose. It's that kind of intensity. And And essentially, Luther started seeing the corruption in the church and like all these problems. So he went to the Württemberg Cathedral, and at this time, the cathedral doors were essentially like
it's like the
bulletin board back in the day.
The town.
And so Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses, which are essentially 95 sentences outlining his problems with the church. Now, at the time, the 95 Theses, even today, are still not recognized as absolutely heretical, because, I mean, they have a whole lot of truth to them. It was what happened after he posted that 95 Theses, which is the big kicker. Luther kind of went anti-papist all of a sudden after having a conversation with the cardinal. And so that kind of really kicked off the Reformation, Luther going anti-papist.
Which is really why Protestants have broken off and formed their own denominations over time. And there's really no central authority like the Catholic Church has the Pope.
Right. And so, and I'd go on Colin's little jump ahead, is how did the Reformation affect Europe then and the world now?
Yes.
Well, Europe then, at that time, Europe was still under the term of Christendom, where like every single person in Europe was the same God, same form of religion, same rights, everything. Now with Reformation, you had one village worshiping the Lutheran version of Christianity, one the Catholicism, another one Zwingli, other one Calvinist. So like you're having a whole mess of different faiths and all that, and the world now is kind of like it's every man to his version of Christianity. Like, I can say God was a rock, or God was like set the world in a clock, which is a deist belief, and thus like left us our own devices. So the Reformation, how it affects the world now, kind of led to Christianity being interpreted on a subjective view instead of the objective view through the Holy Bible and all that. And so, going back to past Europe, the Reformation directly led to one of the bloodiest wars in European history, the 30 Years' War.
Exactly. So take Martin Luther and then fast forward 100 years, starting in 1618. The 30 Years' War was kicked off as a result of militant nationalism and Catholicism versus Protestantism, where secular dynastic considerations were taken by countries who wanted to take over to spread their nationalism while using religion as a means to that end. And so what you had were the Bourbons from France versus the Holy Roman Empire's Habsburgs versus Protestant Sweden and Denmark. So it really took all of Western Europe and resulted in a massive bloodshed that really accomplished very little as a result, except it did result in the separation of church and state and the real birth of Protestantism as an international power religion. In the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, redrew Europe and reestablished how religion would interact with the states.
Right. So the Treaty of Westphalia, if people don't really know, essentially was a treaty that actually then one of the first major treaties that didn't involve the Pope in it. And so what this allowed was, say I was a state in a Holy Roman Empire. So if I was a Protestant, however my population was Catholic, majority Catholic, all those Catholics have to worship my Christianity, or vice versa. If I was Catholic, my majority, the Protestants have to worship Catholicism. So it kind of in a way, it produced more religious tension than it got rid of. And the Treaty of Westphalia also enabled the consolidation of the Holy Roman Empire to a degree, with smaller states like Prussia, Brandenburg, Hessen, Hanover to really expand their borders. And so,
giving the power to these leaders of the principalities caused a division and really a polarization of Catholicism and Protestantism that separated the two religions. When one leader would take over and force his religion upon the group of the population, many of them would leave to more friendly states. So what resulted was a polarization of Protestants in the north and Catholics in the south.
Yeah. However, not leaving our friends across the pond, let's skip on over to our good old boy Henry VIII.
What a guy.
So, for many people who don't know who Henry VIII is, he was a king of England. And essentially, during the Reformation, Henry VIII was a staunch Catholic. He was named Defender of the Faith by the then Pope, and he really wrote against Luther, to which Luther wrote back angrily. But however, what really flipped Henry VIII was when he tried to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Now, for a lot of people who don't know, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon because Henry's older brother died before they could consummate the marriage, and basically the Pope during that time gave an annulment between Catherine and the late Henry's late older brother.
Not an annulment, but a dispensation.
Yeah, dispensation, but literally the same thing at this point. And so the problem with Henry VIII and Catherine at the time was Henry could not produce a male heir, and a lot of people, and for many people who don't know, having a male heir is a massive thing because the male heirs continue on your line. You only have a daughter while your line is extinguished.
And recently, before Henry VIII took over, in his ancestors' times, the War of the Roses happened. And if you are not familiar with the War of the Roses, it was a result of the King of England not producing an heir. And so extended family fought for the throne of it. Fought for the throne.
And so Henry VIII didn't want to have a repeat of that.
Yes.
Still alive.
Let's go.
Okay. And so Henry VIII didn't want a repeat of the War of the Roses, and so he went through his whole process of breaking off from the church to legalize divorce and possibly produce a male heir.
Right. And so Henry VIII really pushed forward making sure Catholicism would, like, his new religion, his new Christianity would be very Catholic. So basically boiling down his religion, his new Christianity, essentially, it was very much Catholic, except one, you can have divorce within it, and two, the King of England, coincidentally Henry VIII, was the head of the church.
Right, and he really wanted to keep it Catholic because he believed in Catholic doctrine, and he professed it very strongly. And it wasn't until his son Edward took over that it became Protestantized. And
Right.
especially it was when Elizabeth I took over that the Anglican Church was really born as a via media, as she put it, between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Right. And so now I think it's time to get into the Counter-Reformation, because I think it's long overdue.
Yes. So the Counter-Reformation. What was it? It was the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. Initiated by the Church, reforms were taken to make an effort to eliminate clerical corruptions and reform indulgences. So what were its effects? Several religious orders, for one, were formed, including the Jesuits, who were an order dedicated to countering Protestantism and heresy. And the Council of Trent was undertaken. Nick, please explain, what was the Council of Trent?
So the full name, the Ecumenical Council of Trent, was called forth by the Pope to address the religious arguments of Protestants, essentially like the Eucharist is only a symbol, not the full body and blood of Christ, or you only need grace to get into heaven. So that council really addressed that, and of course, using St. Thomas Aquinas, as our previous podcast talked about, they really used his arguments, a few others like St. Augustine and a couple of other early church fathers, to kind of like disprove those ideas, saying you do need faith, you do need works of faith and all that. And so the Council of Trent essentially was the Catholic response of, it would believe all these things, you're excommunicate and anathema, which is you're essentially no longer part of the church, you can't be saved. And so I think now it's time to go on to the separation of church and state under Catholicism, because I think that's going to be important to understand.
Larry, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so separation of church and state is exactly what it sounds like. The government decided that it's not going to be with the church, and it's not going to help fund the church in any shape or form. And along with that, the church can't actually influence like the leaders to create laws to favor the church or any other church.
At least not legally.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. So like the church recognized that them having temporal power was a kind of a big problem because I mean the beast indulgences and all that. So they really started to curb that a lot. However, the church didn't fully remove itself from the world essentially because they still had the papal states and also want to make sure that the bishops are preaching this correctly. The seminarians were learning the correct Catholicism. So they still were around, just they were not involved with states and all that.
Right. So the Catholic Church at this point regained a stance as religious guides and no longer a physical power to be reckoned with.
Yeah, this really marked the end of essentially the physical power of the church in Europe, because from this point on, you'll see steady decline of the Pope being used as a mediator. I think one of the last major ones is the coronation of Napoleon back in 1804, and that's kind of like you see that's one of the last big points where the Pope was used in the secular thing.
And some results of religion being pushed to the back burner in Europe was, of course, the rising sense of nationalism that we all know resulted in even more major conflicts.
I won't say the rising sense of nationalism caused that pushback against religion. Keep in mind, like a lot of nationalists at the time viewed religion as a fundamental cornerstone to their countries.
Yes, they did, yes. But in some cases, nationalism became a primary motivator for going to war.
Yeah.
To a degree, of course. Of course, there are other factors. But nationalism did have an effect on that.
All right, let's agree to disagree on that one then. But
hey, fine by me. We're all friends here.
Anyway, so the Protestant, so a lot of people didn't know the Protestant Reformation kind of led towards the formation of independent states and nations. So one of the biggest and probably most important was going to be Prussia. So as earlier I mentioned a state called Brandenburg being created, well, as expanding during the HRE and during the 30 Years' War. So Brandenburg, or essentially expanded in northeast eastern Germany. And so essentially Brandenburg under the Hohenzollern dynasty, please do correct me if I pronounced that one wrong, essentially reformed the state of Prussia. Now, Prussia was a heavily Protestant country with some Catholic and some Jewish influences here and there, but they're primarily Protestant. And so for people who don't really know their history a whole lot, Prussia eventually became the state of Germany by unifying Germany in the late 1800s under Bismarck. And so the Protestant Reformation and subsequently the 30 Years' War was kind of like the final push for the modern Europe to eventually step forth and all that. As you see, states like France, Austria, Czechoslovakia under Bohemia kind of step forth into the limelight, and kind of you see the modern European world starting to shape up.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our final thoughts and conclusions.
Final thoughts, Larry. You got any final thoughts there?
So the Reformation was pretty important. It got some stuff done. One thing that the church did good was the Counter-Reformation, getting that corruption out of the church. So sometimes one good thing happened out of it.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a disaster to happen in order for us to fix the problems that caused the disaster. Unfortunately, it resulted in some of the most bloodshed in the world seen at this time. But history is history, and we can't change that. All we can do is learn from it. Otherwise, we'll repeat it.
So I think I'm the only one that's not talked on this one, but so I do have pretty strong opinions. A lot of people know me privately about the Protestants and the Protestant Reformation as a whole, and not trying to get too biased on this one. Generally, it's kind of a good and a bad thing that Protestant Reformation happened, because yes, the key issues were addressed by the Protestants that were eventually fixed by the Church. But at this point in Europe, especially, like after this, like Christianity, Catholicism starts falling off as more of a instead of important thing, something you're like, oh, you're Catholic, and it's kind of like, oh, you're Catholic, whatever. So it's kind of like Christianity and religion as a whole started becoming less of a thing in Europe, and so that's kind of my big pet peeve about that one. So yeah, I think it's time to close it out.
Yeah. Final wrap up thought here is Protestants today. If you're listening in on this, just know that we love you, but we're right and you're not. But we can appreciate that we have different ideas. And we're always open to dialogue because we all know that yelling matches never get anything solved. And even though we have different ideas, we can appreciate each other. And that's that, I guess. I'm Conlon Taylor. I've been one of your hosts today, joined by everyone's favorite dudes, minus one Chris fan.
He's probably in Vietnam somewhere building a tunnel. Like, I mean, we laugh, but it's probably true.
Well, God bless everybody.
Amen.
Catholics did nothing wrong.
Amen.